Introduction. You clicked for Alexander the Great. You'll get the whole march. First, the problem. A Macedonian upstart faces the Achaemenid giant, the tool, Philip II's war machine, long-piked phalanxes, companions, and Agrianian shock skirmishers. The test. 10 years, 3 decisive battles, 2 brutal sieges, and 1 mutiny. In the next minutes, you'll see the gambles at Granicus, the choke at Issus, the orchestration at Gaugamela, the sea-bound siege of Tyre, the allure of Egypt, and the rain-soaked Hydaspes. Then, the cost. Rebellion, fracture, and the dead king at Babylon. 2. Problem. A young king versus an empire. He inherits a crown, a program of conquest, and a balance sheet that tilts negative. The throne is secure only if the army keeps moving. In 334 BC, Macedon stands as hegemon of Greece after Chyrenia, but that status is brittle. The Greek League has sworn cooperation, yet its loyalty is transactional and contingent. The treasury bears the weight of recent campaigns and the cost of keeping garrisons in line. The new king carries forward a war plan pointed east, across the narrow strait that separates Europe from the Persian shore. Across the Hellespont waits the Achaemenid Colossus, a lattice of satrapies threaded by royal roads that can shift men, horses, and gold at continental scale. Western Asia Minor alone hosts multiple satrapal centers with their own field forces, fleets, and tax bases. From Lydia to Phrygia to Caria, each governor holds fortresses and coastal cities, and behind them sits an imperial administrative machine that can summon mercenaries, levy native contingents, and coordinate grain, pay, and remounts. The coastline bristles with naval stations that can interdict crossings, harass supply lines, and cut communications between Europe and Asia. Macedon brings a smaller professional corps, the phalanx drilled year-round, and a coalition mandate framed as liberation of the Greek cities of Asia Minor. That pledge serves 2 purposes. It finances the war with allied contributions, and it provides political cover for occupying ports, deposing tyrants allied to Persia, and installing friendly councils. But the pledge also imposes a constraint. Failure to protect those cities will be read as bad faith. Hesitation invites revolt in the rear. The political economy of the invasion is simple and unforgiving. Momentum pays the bills. The strategic map sets the stakes. The Hellespont is both barrier and gateway. Control the strait, and Europe and Asia connect by a bridge of ships. Land in the Troad, and the royal road network opens a series of corridors. North to Decilium and Hellespontine Phrygia, south along the coast through Aeolus and Ionia, inland via Sardis toward the Anatolian plateau. Satrapies defend these nodes with garrisons and field forces. Persian admirals can move squadrons to pressure island allies and the Peloponnesian coast. Persian strengths are structural. The empire aggregates wealth from Egypt to Bactria. It commands seasoned noble cavalry, and it hires Greek mercenary hoplites by the thousands. It can replace losses through granaries, treasuries, and an administrative culture that survives individual defeats. Macedonian strengths are kinetic, a compact officer corps welded to a standing infantry line, a cavalry elite trained to strike on signal, and a king who rides at the decisive point. Between those models sits the initial problem: numbers and reach on one side, cohesion and speed on the other. Risk is immediate and terminal. If the crossing fails, Macedonia loses its army to the strait, its king to the river, and its prestige to a story of overreach. The Greek League, sensing weakness, would fracture. Thebes's fate still casts a shadow, but fear erodes quickly when garrisons starve and tribute dries up. Thracian and Illyrian frontiers would flare, rival claimants would surface, allies would hedge, and Persian gold would flow into Greek politics to overturn settlements won at spear point. The war plan admits no safe retreat. Darius III has only recently taken the throne. That matters in two ways. First, the court must consolidate loyalty across the satrapies. Provincial commanders weigh their fortunes as much as their orders. Second, the sheer size of the empire produces administrative inertia. It moves like a caravan, not a raiding party. That inertia cuts both directions. It can field large armies if given time, but it can be wrong-footed by speed, forced into reacting on compromised ground, and coerced into battle before all pieces assemble. The window is narrow, but it exists. The Greek League's pledge to liberate the cities of Asia Minor provides an operational frame. Early victories must target coastal poleis to pull them into the coalition, add ships to the Allied fleet, and deny Persian admirals their harbors. Each liberated city extends the maritime lifeline that feeds the Macedonian army. Each satrapal capital seized unlocks tax revenues, magazines, and hostages. Momentum is not a slogan here, it is logistics made visible. So the question tightens: what converts inferior numbers into decisive momentum across rivers, mountains, and fortified coasts? The answer lies not only in leadership, but in design. The tool is an army engineered in advance for this theater, built by a father who fought on every frontier, and handed to a son who intends to use it. The Sarissa phalanx, a wall of long pikes carried by professional phalangites, holds ground and fixes the enemy. A cavalry arm coalesced around the king offers a hammer that strikes where the line bends. Light troops skilled in rough terrain deny flanks, screen movements, and punish chariots and archers. Siege engineers translate intent into walls breached and ports opened. Standardized equipment, drilled maneuvers, and a command culture that tolerates initiative compress the time between decision and action. This is the payoff of reform. Philip II's innovations transformed a patchwork levy into a precision instrument, one that acts as a single organism at varying speeds, from forced march to shock charge to sustained siege. The reforms alter three variables at once: range, by extending reach with the Sarissa and missile troops; discipline, by drilling formations to pivot without losing cohesion; and speed, by lightening kit, integrating cavalry with infantry, and imposing a cadence of movement that outpaces satrapal coordination. Against larger, slower forces, such an instrument can generate local superiority at the chosen point and hour. None of that guarantees success. It does, however, turn risk into calculable gambles. A smaller army can force crossings before fleets concentrate, pin a larger host in a bottleneck before its cavalry deploys, and hit a royal position while the wings still align. The machine will still need a driver willing to accelerate into danger, to turn a riverbank into a battlefield, and to commit reserves at the exact hinge of the fight. Across the Hellespont, the satraps assemble. Behind them, the royal road runs east to the heartlands. The young king stands on the shore with a plan, a coalition, and a debt schedule that only victory can pay. Now, the weapon he brings to Asia, engineered by his father, driven by his own audacity. 3. Solution. Philip's war machine steel extends policy by a spear's length, and then several more. Philip lengthened Macedon's reach with the Sarissa, an 18-foot pike carried two-handed by professional phalangites. 5 ranks of spearheads projected beyond the front line, a moving hedge that denied entry to cavalry, and punished any infantry that drifted too close. Depth mattered. Files could absorb shock, trade places, and keep the forest of points steady while the rear pressed forward, turning pressure into momentum. Cohesion made it lethal. The phalanx advanced in cadence, shields slung over the shoulder, pikes angled to a common pitch. Officers marked intervals, musicians fixed the pace. In contact, the formation acted like a geared machine. The first ranks stabbed, the next ranks braced, the rear pushed and replaced. What seems simple, men in a block, was in practice a choreography of weight, reach, and patience, drilled until reflex. That strength carried a cost. The phalanx did not pivot well on rough ground. It hated broken terrain, riverbanks, gullies, and sudden flanking pressure. Once engaged, it needed space on its sides and eyes beyond its front. Unchecked, enemy light troops could sting it, and nimble cavalry could slip past its points. The system required components that provided mobility, scouting, and shock at the right moment. Hence the triad that made Macedon dangerous. On one side stood the companion cavalry, heavy, disciplined shock cavalry grouped around the king. Lancers couched, they formed into wedges that focused mass through a single point, a living drill bit designed to open seams and split lines. On the other side ran the Agrianians, elite javelin infantry adept in broken terrain who sprinted ahead to clear ridges, screen the army's movement, and peel skirmishers off the flanks. Between them, a hinge. The hypaspists, the shield bearers, lighter than the phalanx, quicker to wheel, tasked to guard the right flank and serve as a flexible link between infantry wall and charging horse. Each arm had a defined grammar. Companions fixed their strength on timing. They did not mill in front of pikes. They waited for a displacement, then cut through the exposed rib of an enemy line. Hypaspists kept the machine aligned, stepping into gaps, rushing a knoll, or pushing into a breach the moment it appeared. Agrianians fought the fight before the fight, turning stones, scrub, and river shallows into cover, while punishing archers and charioteers who searched for soft edges. Behind them came engineers, with rams, towers, and torsion artillery, because fields do not end where walls begin. Sieges are battles fought vertically. Philip's reforms made these parts interchangeable across theatres. Standardized kit meant the pike lengths matched, sockets fit, and replacements slotted in without delay. Syntagmata, the basic phalanx blocks, matched widths so commanders could recombine them while marching. Signal systems, trumpet calls, flag cues, synchronized movement from right wing to left. That discipline enabled forced marches that arrived intact and deployable, not winded mobs in need of a day's rest. Against this, Persian forces brought variety, money, and numbers. Noble cavalry rode well and in strength. Greek mercenary hoplites could stand toe-to-toe and hold ground. Levies swelled ranks, guarded baggage, and filled trenches. But the composite often lacked a single doctrine, binding it from centre to wing. Satrapal contingents served under local chiefs with their own priorities. Mercenaries fought expertly within their own files, but could not always be keyed to a cavalry charge on a shouted signal. The difference was not bravery, it was integration. Macedon's system leaned on reconnaissance. Scouts rode ahead, not to count banners, but to map edges, where the ground thinned, where a streambed hardened enough to take hooves, which hill could host archers without being turned. Logistics matched that tempo. Column lengths were managed to prevent long tails. Pack animals were assigned by unit to keep resupply predictable. The army's diet adjusted to local grain without disrupting march speed. When the king decided, the army moved as one body, not as a list of parts. The phalanx's rigidity became a tool when properly framed. Fix an enemy with that spear wall, and its front cannot rotate. Press both flanks with hypaspists and skirmishers, and seams appear as units crowd in or recoil. The companions then ride the seam. When a gap opens, as small as a company's front, wedge in, split the formation and aim at the command node. Even if the enemy does not break at once, the threat forces reserves to redeploy inward, weakening pressure on Macedon's left and buying time where the line strains. In siege, the same logic applied. Engineers built a direct answer to walls. Sailors and allied mariners moved timber, ropes and grain. Light troops suppressed defenders on battlements, while towers rolled forward under screens. Ramps went up as quickly as causeways extended into surf. The army did not treat a city as a pause, but as part of the march, an obstacle to be reduced within the campaign's rhythm, not outside it. Training underwrote morale. Men who know their place in a drill meet shock with behavior, not panic. Officers, aggressive in the charge, remained conservative in alignment, checking intervals, redressing ranks, and timing the release of reserves. The king's presence added coherence. When he shifted right, the army understood that the decision point lay there, and recalibrated without a cascade of new orders. 1,000 small frictions, dust, fatigue, fear, were offset by habits learned at Amphipolis and Pella. Think of it as a loom. Thread the long pikes in tight, shuttle the cavalry through when the weave loosens, and bind the edges so the fabric does not fray. Range, discipline, and speed did not live in separate regiments. They were fused into every engagement, giving a smaller force the ability to create local superiority at an hour of its choosing. That is why the reforms were revolutionary. They made decisiveness portable. A machine needs a battlefield to prove it. The first trial meets water, slippery stones, and horsemen massed on a bank that looks uncrossable. The companions lower their lances. Skirmishers wade forward, splashing under arrows. The line behind them steps to the river's lip and locks pike to pike. The river is called the Granicus. Granicus. Risk across a river. Who charges uphill into a river against a cavalry line? The 20-year-old king who intends to set the clock of the war by his watch. At the Granicus, Persian satraps mass their horse along the far bank, knee to knee, with Greek mercenary hoplites held back as a reserve. The river runs shallow but fast over slick sterns, the banks cut and muddy. A crossing under fire means broken formations, floundering mounts, and men exposed chest deep to missiles. Advisors urge delay until morning. Alexander refuses the pause and orders the assault. He leads the right, pushing companions and Paeonian light horse toward a slanted ford. The angle matters. Rather than strike perpendicularly into the steepest climb, he drifts along the current to stretch the Persian front, forcing local redeployments and creating uneven densities along the bank. Hypaspists wade in behind the first riders, shields high, while archers and javelin men on the near side focus their fire on Persian clusters that lean forward to strike. It is a choreography of fractions, half a length of horse gained in the water, a spear thrust intercepted, a foot of firmer footing on the far lip. Contact is immediate and violent. Persian nobles surge their mounts down the slope to smash the heads of wedges before they can climb out. The river turns into a wrestling ground of hooves, spear shafts, and hilts. Macedonian riders brace, lance, and heave, trying to win space for the files behind them to emerge. In the crush, Alexander takes a blow to the head from Rhoesaces that cracks his helmet. He kills his assailant with the counterstroke. A second attacker, Spithridates, wheels to strike from behind, and Clytus the Black shears his arm and saves the king at the edge of the bank. Leadership here is not distant. It is measured in inches and breaths.
The first objective is not annihilation. It is a foothold. Once a few companion wedges crest the bank, they fan a little to relieve pressure. Hypaspists lock shields and hold a small arc of ground. More horse push through the bottleneck. Missile suppression from the near bank keeps the densest Persian knots from leaning their full weight into the melee. As the crossing widens, the phalangites enter in files, pikes high to avoid snagging in the current, then level as boots find purchase. The river, a disruptor, is slowly converted into a boundary behind a growing Macedonian line. Persian deployment looks strong on paper, and yet it hobbles itself. By jamming cavalry along the very edge, they deny their own depth. Horses cannot wheel cleanly on a narrow shelf. Weir ranks cannot feed forward without chaos. Commanders must shout over the water to units they cannot see. The mercenary hoplites placed behind cannot reach the collision before the bank is compromised. They are infantry asked to solve a cavalry problem on a timeline that does not exist. Once the first Macedonian elements establish a contiguous front above the waterline, the Persian plan begins to unwind. In such a fight, the difference is in integration. The companions do not linger in frontal duels once more squadrons clear the lip. They punch at weak points where Persian horses bunch or recoil, creating lanes through which further units flood. Hypaspists guard the seam between horse and pike, preventing countercharges from hooking the shoulder of the phalanx as it forms. Light troops keep up a steady harassment, forcing Persian riders to shield their faces and turn away from the critical moment. With each minute, the Macedonian balance improves. More files formed, more cavalry free to maneuver, more command signals heard. The deaths of Persian leaders compound the breakdown. Nobles who had led the first rush are cut down near the bank, and locally, initiative evaporates. Without clear calls, units either surge alone and die piecemeal, or hold back and watch the Macedonian presence expand. The mercenaries held as a reserve finally advance into a field whose shape has already shifted. They face a consolidated phalanx that now has dry footing and lateral support. Encircled by horse and pressed frontally by pikes, they are ground down. The Persian cavalry, robbed of the bank and scattered in packets, cannot stabilize the center. Granicus becomes a mini case study of the machine at work. A phalanx, once stabilized on an adverse shore, fixes the enemy. Companion wedges, released at the pivot, exploit the first fissures and split the cavalry mass. The hypaspists keep the hinge tight, preventing flanking lozenges from forming. Coordination collapses across the Persian line, because the fight is now occurring on two tempos. Macedonian units acting in sequence on signals, Persian squadrons reacting locally without coherence. What began as a reckless crossing resolves into a deliberate dismantling of a river defense. The cost-benefit is immediate. Asia Minor's western satrapies are opened by the rout. Cities that tied their fortunes to the satraps weigh new oaths. Garrisons judge whether relief is even possible. A victory at the crossing sets a cadence that the empire cannot easily match without a royal army. The message travels faster than horse. The Macedonian king will accept risk to negate Persian numbers, and will do it before dawn.
Why did this work? Audacity mattered, but only because it was paired with terrain reading and timing. The angled approach stretched the defense. Missile suppression blinded and thinned the crest. The deliberate priority on a foothold turned a fluid hazard into a hardpoint. Combined arms sequencing transformed scattered bravery into systemic pressure. Like a lockpick, each tumbler clicked in order. Disrupt, land, link, expand, break, until the mechanism opened. The satraps fall back, the coalition of local powers broken by the death of its chiefs and the loss of the riverbank. The success forces the great king to take personal command, because only a royal presence can reassemble confidence and concentrate resources across the satrapies. The campaign's pace accelerates from raids and crossings to set-piece battles with imperial stakes. Darius will come in person. He will choose ground he thinks will erase the Macedonian edge. He will try to pin the phalanx and envelop the wings in a narrow corridor between mountain and sea. At the Battle of Issus, the bottleneck turns numbers into a liability, and the war's next hinge swings open. 5. Issus, the narrow trap. Why would a great king choose a bottleneck? Because he believes the line will hold while numbers grind the enemy down. At Issus, the ground betrayed that bet. A narrow coastal plain, mountains pinching the inland side, the sea limiting the other, and the Panaris River cutting across the front. Space shrank the Persian advantage from a flood into a channel. Alexander had raced south along the coast, stripping garrisons and drawing supplies, and Darius slipped behind to sever the Macedonian lifeline. Speed answered speed. The Macedonian turn north forced a meeting on terrain that nullified open field maneuvers. The deployments show a deliberate read of that ground. Parmenion took the left toward the water with Greek cavalry and infantry, tasked to absorb the heaviest horse the Persians could throw. The phalanx, the long-piked corps, anchored the center, stepping to the river where the banks allowed a crossing. Alexander stacked the right near the rising foothills with his flexible arm. Agrianians with javelins to scour the rough, archers to smother the far bank, hypaspists ready to pivot, and the companion cavalry formed into wedges under his hand. The instruction was implicit: fix with the center, refuse the left as needed, and drive with the right. The Persian position had logic. Darius held behind the Panaris, his best infantry massed where the Macedonian center would strike hardest. Cavalry layered on the wings. But in a corridor, deployment depth counts more than raw frontage, and local congestion develops faster than orders travel. The river's shallow courses and cut banks favored those who could coordinate crossings under fire. Macedonian skirmishers bit first, aiming to thin and distract. Then the phalanx stepped forward in blocks, points leveled, accepting that initial disorder would cost blood. Alexander moved first with the right. He angled toward the Persian left, using the harder ground near the slope to compress the distance from trot to contact. The companions hit in wedge, point first as Hypaspist surged on the inner shoulder, creating a joint attack that threatened to peel back the flank rather than push it straight back. The moment the wedge crested the riverbank, it fanned just enough to let more squadrons flow through. Shock opened seams. Those seams mattered because there was no open plain behind the Persian line. Only units stacked close and commanders with little room to redeploy.
The center fought brutally. Phalangites, half-soaked and climbing, met hardened infantry and took a step back underweight. Files broke, officers redressed ranks, and the struggle seesawed across the watercourse. In that zone, every foot of bank was contested, and order was hard to impose. Alexander read the friction and shifted emphasis to the breach he had started on the right. He did not let the center define the battle. He made the decision point where he could dictate speed. The breakthrough was not mystical. It was geometry under stress. As the Persian left bent, its units crowded inward, exposing the junction between flank and center. That junction is always the brittle place in a compressed formation. Alexander aimed there. The companions pressed with the lance, then with the sword when files interlocked. The Hypaspists kept the shoulder of the phalanx from being gnawed by countercharges. Once the gap formed, even small, cavalry poured through it at a higher tempo than foot could block. Command psychology took over. A king at the head of armoured horse, within reach and not an emblem on a hill, exerts pressure deeper than his immediate frontage. The royal guard, trained to protect a fixed point, the monarch's chariot, saw the vector of threat line up on their charge. Even if they held for moments, the perception of imminent encirclement is corrosive. Darius did what royal doctrine deems rational when the center is threatened with collapse. He withdrew to preserve the command node for another day. That movement, seen down the line, translated as failure, and cohesion snapped. On the Macedonian left, Parmenian's task had been grim. Persian cavalry swarmed to turn the flank, trying to roll up the line from the sea inward. Outnumbered and under sustained pressure, the left traded ground for time, pulling back in sections, refusing the extreme edge and preventing any clean envelopment. Their containment made the right success usable. Without that restraint, Alexander's thrust would become an isolated salient. The rout was not only bodies on the field, it was prestige burned away. The capture of the royal household amplified the effect of the king's flight, signaling to cities and satraps along the Levant that momentum had shifted decisively. A single victory in a narrow corridor produced cascading political outcomes. Alliances reweighed, gates opened, and negotiations tilted toward Macedon. Yet the map still showed Persian strength at sea and fortified ports that could disrupt supply if left intact. What caught Darius off guard was not only audacity, but the cadence of movement that denied him control of the calendar. Alexander's marches forced battle before the great king could choose open ground, before fleets could trap the Macedonian column against the coast, before reinforcements reached the Pinarus in order. Speed made the bottleneck inevitable. The terrain then did what doctrine predicts. It converted a numerical edge into a traffic problem, and an integrated strike team into a spear that could find the seam and rip it. The road south opened. Sidon and the coastal ports watched which side could command the sea lanes and the grain. Persian admirals still held squadrons, and island strongholds could threaten any army that turned its back. Securing the flank meant more than banners on land. It demanded neutralizing the last Persian lever. Naval reach coupled with a fortress that sat on stone in the surf. He turns from a river battle to a siege question. An island city with double walls and a proud fleet refuses passage and pledges. To control the coast and protect his rear, he chooses the hardest option. He will drag the land to the walls of Tyre.
6. Tyre. Why siege an island? Bypass or besiege? He picks the siege because leaving Tyre intact would hand Persia a naval dagger aimed at his supply line. The island city dominates a deep water harbour. Its Phoenician crews can scout, raid transports, and ferry Persian envoys along the coast. A march past the walls risks attrition by sea, a blockade of allied ports, and sudden sorties against his rear. The calculus is harsh, a costly delay now to remove the strongest base in the Levant, or a faster advance shadowed by ships that can starve the campaign. The geography dictates the method. Tyre sits off the mainland on rock, with double walls hardened by generations of maritime wealth. A fleet behind those ramparts threatens any siegecraft that ventures too close. Alexander answers with engineering at scale. He orders a causeway, a stone and timber mole to bridge the strait, a moving road for rams, towers, and Torsion artillery. The project is part construction, part battle. Every cartload of rubble, every driven pile, advances the shore under arrows and sling stones. Progress triggers countermeasures. Tyrian sailors strike with fire ships, drifting them into the work to ignite timber frames and the wooden superstructures of siege towers. Sorties lash the edges of the mole, picking off engineers and pulling down revetments. The sea itself assists the defenders as storms chew at the unfinished face and return boulders to the channel. The Macedonians rebuild, lay a thicker stone to resist wash, extend breakwaters to blunt waves, and push the line forward again. Each setback tightens the resolve to finish the bridge. Sea control becomes the second front. A mole alone cannot suppress a fleet. To neutralize Tyre's mobility, Alexander captures ports along the Phoenician coast and assembles allied squadrons, converting local ships into an operational blockade. Once friendly hulls crowd the water, the dynamic flips. Tyrian raiders lose space to maneuver. Resupply by sea narrows. The defenders must now guard against rams and boarding, as well as artillery from the causeway. The siege turns from a one-sided harassment into a contested ring that steadily constricts. Siege engines multiply the pressure. Giant towers roll down the mole, taller than the city parapets, with catapults on the upper stages to clear defenders and ballistae on lower decks to smash crenellations. Ramming galleries move up under screens, while sappers probe for weak seams in the foundations. The wool trade becomes attritional, stone for stone, timber for timber, blood for time. Tyrian counterworks try to absorb impacts and douse fires, but the combined weight of artillery and the encircling fleet erodes local advantages. The political dimension runs alongside the engineering. Alexander needs the Levant to submit without repeated sieges, a visible methodical reduction of the strongest city-states a rule. Resistance is expensive and ultimately futile. That message aims not only at coastal elites, but at satraps weighing their loyalties, while Darius raises another army. If Tyre falls while the great king rebuilds, Persian naval leverage collapses, and the coastal poleis recalibrate in favor of Macedon. The contest tightens month by month. With ports flipped and squadrons aligned, Macedonian ships probe the harbour, while the mole inches forward. Artillery duels favour the besieger as platforms stabilise and angles to the walls improve. Tyrians continue to strike with craft and timing. But their sorties face a layered response. Archers nested on tower decks, marines ready to board, and shore-based engines ranging the approaches. Each failed burn runs up the ledger of material lost that cannot be replaced under blockade. A breach on the southern sector becomes the lever. Continuous bombardment destabilizes a segment. Rams worry the crack. Then, coordinated assaults converge by sea and by the mole. Once a storming party establishes a foothold on the wallwalk, the geometry changes decisively. Troops pour through openings widened under cover of missiles. Defenders struggle to mass at the point because the attackers strike from two axes. The city falls after 7 months of grind, long enough to test endurance, short enough to foreclose a Persian naval resurgence. Reprisals follow with purpose. Executions and enslavements occur on a large scale, not as rage but as policy, a deterrent calibrated to warn every port still calculating whether to resist. The cost in lives and material is real, but the strategic payout is immediate. The principal naval base in the Levant is neutralized. Hostile squadrons lose anchorages. Communications inland stabilize. Grain and pay can move under a Macedonian umbrella. Why tire? Because sea control and psychological dominance outweigh the time lost. The mole, the towers, the Allied fleet, together they turn an island's immunity into a liability. The siege strips Persia of its maritime card on this coast and replaces uncertainty with a corridor of secure harbours. It shows a theatre-level truth. Engineering can extend operational reach where manoeuvre alone cannot. The campaign now pivots from coercion to legitimacy. With the coastline secured and the fleet networked to his supply train, Alexander turns to Egypt, a land whose grain, ports, and religious authority can stabilize the next phase. In Memphis, he will accept a local crown to anchor rule. At Siwa, the oracle will raise his status beyond king. On the Nile Delta, he will cite a city to command trade from the Mediterranean into the Middle East. The road from destruction to coronation runs along that new maritime artery. Fleets escort transports. Satraps watch the wind shift. Cities open their gates rather than gamble on isolation. The army, no longer shadowed by hostile cruisers, marches without having to look over its shoulder. Egypt waits with stores, shipyards, and rituals that transform conquest into governance. From a stormed wall to a scepter extended, the war shifts register. The next moves are not against battlements, but toward a throne and a foundation stone on a stretch of coast that will anchor influence for centuries. 7. Egypt, crown and city. From destruction to coronation, the campaign shifts. Egypt receives Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule and offers a different prize: authority that does not depend on garrisons alone. At Memphis, the rituals matter as much as troop movements. He performs sacrifices and accepts the pharaonic crown, a deliberate entry into the religious and civic order of the Nile. Priests who support can stabilize tax collection and civic obedience, mark the transition from conqueror to king within an existing hierarchy. He needs more than ceremony. Egypt provides grain, shipyards, and the coastline of sheltered roadsteads. Grain secures the army's sustenance. Shipyards service transports and warships now operating along a safer Levantine line. The Nile Valley's predictable harvests reduce dependence on captured satrapal magazines farther east. Ports on the Mediterranean create a forward logistics screen to receive convoys and disperse them to Syria and beyond. The most audacious administrative stroke comes on the coast. Alexander selects a site for a new city at a maritime crossroads and orders its foundation. Alexandria. The location on the Mediterranean with access to sea lanes and inland routes turns geography into strategy. A harbour anchors fleets, attracts merchants and supplies the army. A grid plan imposes order that officials can govern. The placement also offers defensive depth, a firm base from which to project power, and a refuge against any resurgent Persian naval activity in the Middle East. Alexandria's plan is functional. Streets in a grid ease movement and policing. Defined quarters simplify taxation and provisioning. A capacious harbour, screened and workable in varied weather, becomes the beating heart of commerce. The lighthouse to come, more than a landmark, will guide hulls through busy approaches, reduce wrecks and raise throughput. A Greek city on Egyptian soil, it invites settlers from across the Aegean, yet sits astride Nile traffic and desert caravans, knitting Mediterranean and African trade into one exchange. This is consolidation by design. A permanent administration needs a capital that welcomes governors, scribes, and traders. A war needs a port that can turn around grain and armament quickly. The new city provides both. Its cosmopolitan charter encourages immigration of artisans and merchants who bring skills, credit, and ships. Its harbour becomes a staging area, not just for fleets guarding the coast, but for the logistics that must feed the march east. The coronation at Memphis and the oracle at Siwa operate as parallel instruments. At Memphis, public rites signal respect for Egyptian institutions. At Siwa, the oracle of Ammon confers an elevated status that Greeks and Egyptians interpret through their own traditions. Divine sanction, conveyed through accepted channels, strengthens obedience among locals and increases the king's standing among his Macedonian and Greek officers, who see a ruler aligning religious authority with military success. Administrative choices follow the same logic. He installs satraps to manage revenue and law, but he leaves local institutions intact where they function. Temples administer lands and festivals. Native officials continue routine duties under oversight. This reduces friction and frees Macedonian manpower for campaigning, shifting garrisons from permanent occupation to strategic nodes, fortresses, ports, and road junctions. Integration replaces wholesale replacement. Legitimacy here is not ornamental. When tax collection flows through recognized priests and notaries, compliance rises and enforcement costs fall. When a new city promises profit, merchants hedge toward the ruling power. When a crown comes with ceremonies the population understands, public order stabilizes. The army moves without having to leave behind large detachments to coerce. Strength at the front grows because the rear no longer bleeds men to hold sullen territories.
Alexandria also functions as a communications hub. Couriers by sea shorten the command cycle. Dispatches can run from the Aegean to Egypt and then upriver with predictable timing. Grain stored in secure silos can be released on command to match campaigning seasons. Armies live on calendars. Alexandria gives Alexander a clock he controls. The analogy is a keel under a ship. Without it, the vessel wobbles no matter how strong the sails and crew. With it, speed converts cleanly into direction. Egypt supplies that keel. Grain, ports, and ritual authority align to stabilize the forward motion of the campaign. The army that fought along rivers and causeways now rests on a maritime platform that extends its range and absorbs shocks. The political signal radiates outward. Phoenician ports see a ruler who can break an island citadel and then be anointed in Memphis. Greek cities note a foundation intended to outlast the war, a city that promises trade and patronage. Egyptian elites see continuity with their rights, not the erasure of their order. Persian administrators, watching from the heartland, face an adversary who is not exhausting his base, but consolidating it. Meanwhile, the military machine does not idle. Engineers survey docks, quartermasters map storage, officers rotate detachments to guard against revolt. The force prepares for inland marches with secure resupply and a reliable wintering pool. An army that can feed itself and pay its men keeps cohesion. An army that believes its ruler has divine favor holds discipline longer under strain. 5 weeks later, the caravans run more regularly. The Nile Delta channels timber and grain to shipyards. Convoys depart under escort. Cavalry remounts straw from healthier stocks. Alexandria's site proves its worth as horse and hulls move in a predictable rhythm. The city is not yet complete, but its skeleton already serves as a forward base. With the western flank secured and the sea lanes guarded, the campaign's compass points east. The capitals of the Achaemenids, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, now lie on a line that logistics can support and politics can absorb. The next phase will test not only field tactics, but the balance between vengeance and governance, as treasuries open and symbols of empire come within reach. Legitimacy, logistics, and a forward base have combined to make continued conquest feasible. The army leaves Egypt with fuller magazines and a stronger claim to rule, capable of striking at the heartlands without dragging a precarious tail of supply. The march turns inland toward palaces whose flames will write an argument in fire. 8. Gaugamela, the orchestration. Darius chooses the ground near Arbela, a field scraped and levelled to give scythed chariots room to run and cavalry space to swarm. The host he brings is immense, with massed horse on both wings and shock elements arrayed to break cohesion before the Macedonian line can bite. The open plain appears to erase Alexander's advantages. If he blunders straight ahead, he feeds the phalanx into mobility and gets enveloped. Alexander rewrites the script by refusing a frontal alignment. He shifts his right obliquely, edging away from his original axis and pulling the Persian left outward. That sidestep forces Darius to countermarch to protect his own flank and stretches the line into thinner fabric. The move looks like drift. It is measured. Chariots launch to disrupt the phalanx before the geometry settles. Skirmishers run forward, Agrianian javelin men and archers, to bleed the teams and target drivers. Gaps open within the Macedonian front, not from panic but by design. Lanes through which sized axles pass without carving blocks of men. The chariots spend their momentum on air and scattered bodies, not on locked files. Once beyond the line, they hit rear guards and are pulled down. As the Persian left extends to shadow the oblique right, a seam develops near the center, where a pivoting mass can no longer cover the junction. Alexander watches for that slackening of thread. The phalanx, steady but under pressure on its exposed shoulders,
advances by syntagmata, each block dressing its intervals while horse on both sides probe for angles. The king holds his strike until the tug creates a narrow opening, then the pivot. Companions form wedge, points inward, and drive at speed into the seam, with hypaspists tightening the hinge between cavalry and pike. The thrust is not wide, it is deep, a spear point aimed at the center of gravity, the royal position. Dust rises, signals cut through with trumpets, and the wedge punches through units too thin to stop it and too engaged on the flanks to rotate. Darius faces an old problem of monarchic command. The presence of the king stabilizes morale, but it also concentrates risk. When the companions break through the seam and angle toward the chariot, the royal guards must decide whether to hold where they stand or wheel to face threat at close range. Even a controlled rearward movement can look like flight. In an army built around a single will, a perceived breach at the center unravels confidence faster than casualties. Across the field, the Macedonian left is in crisis. Parmenion absorbs a storm of cavalry, trying to fold the line back and sever contact with the center. Underweight for the task, his wing yields ground in measured steps, refusing the extreme flank to prevent envelopment. Messengers ride hard between wings. For a moment, the army fights two battles: exploitation on the right, survival on the left, linked by a center under grinding pressure. The phalanx holds because it was made to hold under lateral strain. Phalangites brace, replace ranks, and adjust facing by files as horsemen test the edges. Officers keep the sarissa hedge level, while the rear files press forward to maintain depth. The line is not elegant, it is functional, a machine absorbing shock while the decisive arm works. At the height of the push, command friction nearly splits the Macedonians. Reports from Parmenion ask for relief. Alexander has a choice: pursue the collapsing center toward the king, or break off the chase and restore the left. He turns, pulling part of the companions back across the field to strike the cavalry threatening to roll the line. The maneuver risks losing the prize to save the army. It preserves the army. The Persian army meanwhile suffers from the curse of reach. Its wings operate with energy, but coordination over such breadth lags. Where the companions have pierced, units behind must pivot through crowds and dust to seal the wound. Where Parmenion holds, waves of horse cannot synchronize their hits long enough to crack the hinge. The initial design, flatten the field, unleash chariots, envelop, meets an opponent who refuses to be pinned and forces the decisive contest at the nerve center instead of at the edges. Once Darius moves off the field, the result becomes cumulative. Local resistance continues in knots, elite infantry fighting hard, cavalry units executing withdrawals, but the spinal cord is gone. The Macedonian left stabilizes as the pressure eases. The phalanx steps forward to realign, and pursuit begins along channels where the enemy's own cleared ground offers no sanctuary. The vastness of the host turns from asset to weight. Strategically, the fight demonstrates a clear logic. Lure a wing into overextension, create a seam near the center, strike with concentrated shock, and force the king into a choice that radiates panic. It is not mysticism. It is geometry and timing applied to an army whose morale is keyed to a single figure. Break the mind of the army, and the body follows. But victory expands problems as well as maps. With Darius in flight again, the imperial capitals lie open. That means treasuries, archives, and the courtly class that must be managed, not only defeated. It also means a larger footprint to administer, more satrapies to watch, and an army that begins to believe the war can be won faster than governance can be built. The prepared field near Arbela, tailored for scythed chariots, failed to deliver decision because the Macedonian plan disarmed it. Skirmishers blunted the blades. Gaps in the line bled momentum. The oblique march stretched the formation that needed to stay compact. The decisive thrust went not through numbers, but through a misaligned seam, straight at the point where perception drives collapse. Babylon yields without a fight. Susa opens its treasuries and sends its silver into Macedonian hands. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart, will not be a ledger entry. Flames will write the next sentence. 9. Fire at Persepolis Conqueror's Parade. Alexander likes a match. After Susa's keys in silver, Persepolis falls, ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid order, where carved stairways broadcast submission and treasuries anchor legitimacy. The march that brought him here was military. What follows is political theatre, with fire as its grammar. Persepolis is not only storage, it is a charter in stone. Reliefs depict envoys from satrapies bringing tribute. Halls amplify the presence of imperial authority. By taking it, he takes the stage where Persia told the world it ruled. By breaching its treasuries, he seizes more than bullion. He captures the means to fund a new hierarchy, pay garrisons, hire artisans, and settle veterans in newly compliant lands. The army stands at a fork, loot or reconcile. Greek memory pushes hard in one direction. Stories of Xerxes' sack of Athens, the burning of temples on the Acropolis, circulate among officers and infantry. The emotional ledger invites repayment. Governance, however, demands restraint. Keep local elites, protect artisans, and turn a conquered capital into a functioning node within the new administration. The tension is not abstract. It runs through mess tents and councils. The palace complex burns. Ancient accounts divide on motive. Some frame a calculated statement to close the Greek-Persian account with an answering kind. Others describe a drunken revel that escalated into a torching led by courtiers, dancers, and soldiers in a swagger of victory. The sources conflict, the fire does not. Roofs fall, columns blacken, and the symbol of Achaemenid prestige collapses into cinders, visible for miles. Consequences begin at once. The blaze becomes a proclamation that the old dynasty's sanctuaries cannot protect its memory, that a new arbiter of punishment now sits at the center. It satisfies the faction that wanted vengeance, and it terrifies communities still weighing whether to resist. Yet, even while ash settles, practical governance resumes elsewhere. He spares artisans, counts stores, and parcels out responsibility for surviving estates. The spectacle deviates from the longer campaign's needs, but the apparatus of rule continues to assemble. Persepolis's destruction functions like striking a seal off a document. The charter remains legible, but the stamp is gone. Across the satrapies, notables grasp the shift. Many Persian elites, rational actors in a time of transition, enter his service. They bring scribal skill, tax knowledge, and networks that cannot be fabricated overnight. They also bring customs. Court protocol seeps into the Macedonian camp. Dress elements, ceremonial entrances, layers of deference around the ruler. That adoption unsettles the rank and file. Macedonian officers, proud of rough equality beside a campaigning king, watch their leader absorb elements of Persian autocracy. The distance between ruler and companions lengthens by degrees. A bow in the antechamber is no longer a simple courtesy. It threatens to become proskinesis, a ritual of submission many Greeks reserve for gods. The policy is double-edged. It smooths interactions with Persian nobility and helps stabilize revenue. It sours old loyalties and seeds future mutiny. The broader administration pivots on this blend of spectacle and pragmatism. In one province, brutal reprisals secure a road. In another, a Persian governor retains office under Macedonian oversight. Satrapies still need audits, roads still need guards, and canals still require maintenance, regardless of what burned on a terrace in Fars. The machine of empire, once created, is hard to replace. It is easier to redirect it, then stamp a new name on its outputs. Why burn Persepolis? Because a war built on symbolism and memory as much as on sarissas needed a closure that everyone could read. The fire closes the Greek-Persian ledger in a language soldiers and city elders both understand. It says that the dynasty, which claimed cosmic sanction, has lost not only fields and treasurers, but sanctuaries. It proclaims a new order with the blunt clarity of smoke. Yet, that clarity complicates rule. You cannot burn a capital and then ask all its servants to forget the smell. Integration must follow intimidation, or the empire becomes a string of bonfires and garrisons. Meanwhile, the operational map shifts. With the ceremonial heart charred and the fiscal arteries rerouted, the war moves from decisive battles to pursuit and pacification. Darius has fled east, drawing the line of conflict into the highlands and steppe corridors of Media and beyond. Army tempo changes. Instead of set-piece clashes on leveled plains, detachments fan out along royal roads, secure depots, and hunt for the court on the move. The chase imposes new demands. Winter quarters matter. Grain depots in Mesopotamia must link to foraging zones in Media. Mounts must survive long marches between watered corridors. The fleet, so decisive along the Levant, recedes in direct utility. The cavalry arm expands in importance. Intelligence networks, often run by Persian officials now under Macedonian direction, deliver reports that substitute for banners seen on horizons. As the pursuit lengthens, governance deepens. He confirms some satraps, replaces others, and installs Macedonian controllers over treasuries. He tests loyalty with hostages and marriages. He courts temple establishments where they anchor compliance. Every mile east increases the need to delegate, to trust men who, a year earlier, fought for the great king, or else slow to a crawl under the weight of direct command. Persepolis' ruins fade behind the columns, yet the imprint remains, especially among Macedonians, who now watch their leader adopt more Persian ceremony. The same blaze that unified a narrative of revenge opens a crack in the army's culture. Veterans accept hard marches. They balk at transformed etiquette. The paradox hardens. The policies that ease rule over Persians erode solidarity among those who conquered them. Darius's flight ends not with a final stand in the west, but with betrayal in the east. His murder in transit removes a rallying point and creates a pretender. Bessus, a satrap who claims royal status, steps into the vacuum and inherits an enemy with momentum. The frontier shifts to Central Asia, where fortresses perch above river valleys and insurgency replaces pitched battle as the daily grind. The march goes on, away from palaces and lustral fires.
into a theatre of raids, garrisons, and winter campaigns. The fire at Persepolis closes one chapter with smoke and opens another with dust.
10. On the Eastern Front, Bactria to the Indus conquest ends armies. It begins insurgencies. On the Eastern Front, the chase after Darius dissolves into a grind of raids and reprisals across Bactria and Sogdiana, where river valleys cut the highlands into corridors and fortresses perch on crags. The terrain punishes columns that move like parade ground blocks. Winter clamps down, steppe winds flay men and horses, and every mile demands a garrison to hold it. Alexander enters a theatre where decisive battles yield to attrition and endurance. The Macedonian machine was built to break lines on open fields, not to patrol ridges day after day. Phalangites with the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, cannot wheel quickly in gullies or chase raiders across scree. Cavalry struggles to find pasturage, remounts thin out, and long supply lines thread back to satrapal depots captured months earlier. Morale strains under small victories that do not end resistance. Officers used to clear objectives watch enemies melt into ravines and reappear behind them a week later. Adaptation begins with tempo. He forms flying columns, mixed detachments of horse, hypaspis, and Agrianian skirmishers. Tasked to strike fast at dispersed bands, seize fords before news travels, and torch stockpiles that feed insurgents. Garrisons shift from temporary camps to fortified settlements, stone-faced posts at river crossings and road junctions that project force and anchor tax collection. Engineers, who once built towers against city walls, now lay out forts that can winter a company and hold grain against sudden sieges. Local allies become force multipliers. Not every clan welcomes a satrap who fled or a pretender who taxes hard. Alexander cultivates chiefs with stipends, command titles, and hostages treated as honored guests. Intelligence, who crossed which pass when a harvest is stored, where a rebel sleeps, arrives faster and costs fewer lives than a sweep through empty hills. When rebels disperse, allied riders pursue where heavy cavalry cannot, and they return with guides for the next raid. Politics intertwines with the campaign. Marriages become instruments of alliance, the most notable being Alexander's union with Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble. The gesture signals inclusion to regional elites and softens resistance among factions weary of constant war. Later, mass weddings bind Macedonian officers to women from noble houses across the satrapies, attempting to braid loyalties into the new order. These are not romances staged for poets. They are contracts written in ceremony, meant to hold when garrisons move on. Satrapal reshuffles follow revolts. Commanders who fail, extort, or rebel are removed, replaced with men judged loyal or capable, sometimes Persians who accept the new hierarchy, and sometimes Macedonians who can keep the books as well as the peace. Treasury controllers, separate from satraps, watch the flow of silver and grain. The system grows more complex because it must. An army on the far side of Asia needs revenue streams that do not collapse when it rides north for a season. The cultural question grows sharper as the marches lengthen. Alexander adopts elements of Persian dress at court and experiments with proskynesis, a bow before the ruler that Persians perform to kings and Greeks reserved for gods. The fusion aims to normalize dealings with Persian aristocrats and scribes whose cooperation makes government work. Macedonian companions bristle. They read distance where Persians read dignity. Campfire talk turns uneasy. Loyalty to a commander in the fight begins to rub against alien ceremonial in the tent. Discipline holds because victories continue, but the victories are granular.
A citadel on a spur yields after a night assault. A river crossing is forced under snow. A rebel chief swears again and sends a son as surety. The map shows colour spreading across valleys, yet the white space in the mountains stays restless. Regions are pacified, not subdued. They obey when watched, and they test the cordon when columns march south. Logistics evolve to support this new war. Depots are staged along royal roads, with guarded relays for grain and forage. Remount pools are reorganized, drawing from horse breeding districts under close supervision, while veterinary care improves out of necessity. Horses are now the irreplaceable asset. Signals adjust to broken ground. Messengers double back through posts instead of riding straight lines. The army learns to live on smaller, denser packets of supply that survive ambushes and reach forts before snow seals passes. Operationally, the loom analogy still holds, but the shuttle moves differently. The long pikes form the secure base from which flying columns depart. Hypaspis act as hinges on rocky ledges. Agrianians clear ravines and screen camps. Cavalry finishes what foot begins or pins while sappers climb. Sequencing remains the core skill, only now the sequence repeats every week, not every season. Patience replaces spectacle. These campaigns also harden the habit of political experimentation. Mixed garrisons embed local troops with Macedonian cadres. Bilingual decrees circulate. Tax remissions buy quiet winters. Punitive raids answer betrayals. The system can flex, but it absorbs friction with every bend. Officers who married locally weigh competing obligations. Veterans resent settlements that feel too Persian or too soft on former enemies. The bonds that held at Issus and Gaugamela stretch under a different weight. As resistance ebbs, ambition shifts. Reports drift in from beyond the Hindu Kush of rich plains, new kings, and war elephants guarding river lines swollen by monsoon rains. Glory lies east, and trade routes beckon. A pacified backcountry, good enough for now, frees the main force to turn toward the Indus and the kingdoms that hold its crossings. The plan requires speed before snows close the passes and before garrisons lose the thread. He aims for India. The army moves through the high gates again, staged by forts that now feed them, toward a theatre where the enemy brings animals the phalanx has not faced in mass. War elephants break formations by fear as much as by force. Rivers flood in cycles that erase fords and smash pontoon bridges. The problems change, and the machine must change with them. The mini payoff of this eastern grind is clear. Versatility and political experimentation keep the advance alive. Flying columns cut insurgency's rhythm. Alliances stitched by marriage and office hold just enough. Satrapal audits keep revenue flowing to pay men who have marched for years. But every solution opens a seam. Adoption of Persian court forms anger's Macedonian identity. Integrated units complicate command. Officers with local ties hesitate at harsh orders. The army that could move as one organism now contains competing nerves. On the Eastern Front, conquest turns fluid. The map is not erased. It is constantly redrawn. Alexander turns from mountains and forts to a river war against a different kind of enemy. The Hydaspes will test his tactics against elephants and water that rises like a wall. 11. Hydaspes against elephants. How do you break a wall that moves and tramples? At the Battle of the Hydaspes, the wall has tusks and a mind of its own. Monsoon rains swell the river into a slick barrier. Banks churn to mud, currents dragging at hooves and sandals. On the far shore, King Porus arrays chariots and infantry with elephants spaced along the line, each animal a tower that can scatter men, crush light cavalry, and frighten horses into bolting. A direct daylight crossing would feed Macedonian units piecemeal into shock beasts and archers. Alexander refuses that exchange. He spends days fainting along the bank, riding up and down with detachments, beating drums, showing columns where the crossing looks likely. At night, he moves the piece that matters. With selected forces, companion cavalry, light horse, hypaspis, and skirmishers, he marches upstream through rain and thickets to a bend screened by islands and brush. The crossing happens in silence. Boats shuttle, men wade. Squadrons form in the half-light on ground that is firm enough to launch a charge. Porus reads the deception late but reacts with professionalism, sending a forward detachment to check the bridgehead. Alexander's opening task is classic. Destroy the screening force quickly to create space for the rest to land. Light troops pin and pelt. Companions punch. The enemy recoils. With a foothold established, he advances toward the main line before Porus can mass every elephant and cavalry regiment. Tempo becomes the decisive asset because an elephant line grows more dangerous as it stabilizes. The deployment on both sides shows clear doctrines in collision. Porus keeps elephants distributed through his infantry to stiffen the foot and deter cavalry from slicing between battalions. Cavalry anchors the wings, ready to envelop if Macedon commits too deep at the center. Alexander mirrors strength with flexibility. Cavalry on his right under his direct hand, lighter horse on the left to hold, and Harry, hypaspis bridging to the phalanx that forms in depth behind. The ground remains broken and wet, hostile to chariots. Elephants, however, do not need smooth lanes to kill, as battle rages in a bloody rage. The field is churned by elephants and men. Macedonian losses are heavier than in set-piece victories against Persian hosts. Horses bear the memory of tusks. Yet the tactical lessons are clear. Flexible intervals in the phalanx turn a stampede into a solvable geometry. Skirmishers targeting control crews degrade the elephant's effectiveness faster than stabbing at leathered hides. Staged cavalry pressure, sequenced to draw off reserves, breaks the human parts of the formation that make elephants lethal instead of chaotic. Rain keeps falling. Monsoon rivers do not care about laurels. After the victory, attrition and exhaustion rise. The march continues east only to meet a different wall, the will of men who have marched for years. At the Bees, officers and veterans halt, unwilling to cross into lands with more kings, more rivers, and more elephants. Glory cannot refill ranks emptied by disease and rain. The mini-payoff stands. Against elephants, Macedonian doctrine adapts. Leave lanes, kill control, and cut the wings so the center bleeds alone. The machine that crossed at the Granicus and split Gaugamela can also survive a trample if it chooses where to bend and where to strike. But victory intersects with human limits. The next movement is not a charge. It is an argument in a wet camp, a decision at the edge of a river whose far bank they will not see. Rain and weariness harden into open defiance. The Hephaestes mutiny begins at 12. Fracture, mutiny, return, and death. An army that had crossed continents refuses one more march. At the Hephaestes, rain beats tents, wounds fester, and men count the miles home rather than the kings ahead. Veterans who had held formation under elephants now refuse the abstract promise of the ocean. They ask for rest, estates, and the return that was deferred after every battle. Alexander calls assemblies, argues for glory and discovery, points to maps that end at water, and receives silence hardened into a wall. Omens are read and reread. No sign moves men who have buried too many friends under monsoon clouds. The limit is not tactical, it is human. Casualties, distance and weather have ground down resolve. Officers who once pressed his case now hedge, sensing that one more forced crossing might shatter cohesion. The king tests the will of the ranks with staged reviews. Files stand rigid but do not bend. When he withdraws to a tent and waits for the army to beg him forward, no delegation comes. Authority built on victory meets the fatigue of years. He concedes the march east is over. The decision splits by element. He orders a return, but not a retreat. Part of the force will go by sea under Nearchus, charting the coast from the Indus to the Persian Gulf, scouting harbours and tides for future fleets. The main body will march overland by routes that mark the map for administration, down the Hydaspes, through the lower Indus, then west. He intends to write logistics into geography, turning rivers into corridors of rule. Then he chooses Gedrosia. The desert route is a test and a statement, a line through sand where supply collapses if planning fails. The columns stretch thin, wells prove shallow or fouled, guides misjudge distances, heat kills as surely as arrows. Men drop under loads, horses founder, and camels die with panniers full of grain that bakes into useless bricks. Rations are cut. Water is rationed to cups. Units stagger forward on night marches, burying those who fall by moonlight. The march becomes a ledger of attrition paid without the honour of battle. Rapid collapse follows, because the architecture is personal. There is no clear heir. An unborn child by Roxana, a half-brother compromised by health, and marshals whose loyalty ran through the king rather than through institutions. The army's unity had been operational, not constitutional. Without a single will to coordinate satrapies, fleets, and garrisons, the realm fractures along command lines. Officers who had cooperated in siege ladders now bargain for provinces and recruit units they once commanded together. Wars of the Diadochi begin. The empire tears into successor kingdoms that still speak the language of Macedonian victory, but fight each other for inheritance. In Egypt, Ptolemy consolidates with a fleet and a defensible river valley, taking the body of Alexander as a political relic and anchoring legitimacy in Alexandria's institutions. In Asia, Seleucus builds a sprawling dominion by mastering satrapal networks from Syria to the upper satrapies, trading withdrawals for depth and stabilizing through cities and road control. In Macedonia and Greece, Antigonid power surges and contracts as coalitions form and break. The map fixes into Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and Antigonid cores after years of sieges, betrayals, and pitched battles. Yet the space he cleared does not snap back. The corridors he forced with pikes and oars fill with merchants, administrators, and scholars. Koine Greek becomes a working tongue across ports and capitals. New cities carry his name or his model. Old temples host new patrons who rule through ledgers as much as by lance. Arms had drawn the lines, culture begins to hold them. The army that refused one more march had sensed the edge of its endurance. The ruler who turned back chose a hard road to prove resolve and paid for it in bone and blood. His death exposed a central truth of his creation. A state anchored to a single mind is brilliant in motion, fragile at rest. The war's momentum breaks into competing rhythms, but the routes remain open, and the next chapter runs along them. 13. Legacy. The Hellenistic world empires die. Languages travel. After the marches stop and the marshals divide provinces, the map resets into a new equilibrium from Greece to the Indus. Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia emerge from wars of allocation, then stabilize by roads, cities, and taxes. Political unity dissolves, yet the corridors Alexander opened, royal roads, river routes, Maritime chains fill with traffic. Power fragments, but communication quickens. The question follows, was the campaign a failure because the empire split, or a transformation because networks endured? The answer lies in what moved, not who ruled. Armies drew lines. Merchants, scholars, and officials learned to use them. Koine Greek, a practical, simplified Greek, becomes a lingua franca from Alexandria to Ai Khanum. Traders use it to draft contracts. Governors issue decrees in it alongside local scripts. Scholars publish texts that a clerk in Syria can read and a banker in the Aegean can finance. Language lowers transaction costs and knits ports and capitals into a working economy. Cities anchor the system. Alexandria, planned on a grid with broad avenues and a capacious harbour, turns into a nexus for scholarship and trade. Its institutions, museum, libraries, courts, workshops, draw talent and capital. Shipyards build and repair fleets. Warehouses stack grain for winters and campaigns. Scribes copy texts that travel with caravans. Seleucid foundations replicate the pattern farther east. Antioch on the Orontes, Seleucia on the Tigris, and a string of satrapal centres along royal roads, each a market, barracks, and tax office combined. Urbanization under successor kings hardwires the conquests into daily life. Art and religion adapt at the seams. In Gandhara, workshops blend Greek proportion with Buddhist themes, draped robes, realistic hair, and serene expressions applied to bodhisattvas and Buddhas. Coins show Greek legends on one side, local deities or scripts on the other, advertising legitimacy to mixed audiences. In temples and shrines, dedications appear in multiple languages. Processions carry symbols that speak to more than one tradition. The visual language of kingship, diadems, scepters, radiate crowns, travels with garrisons and artists, making royal power legible across satrapies. Yet power politics do not vanish. Wars flare between successor states. Local dynasts rise and fall. The boundaries inside Asia shift with every generation. Still, the continuity of practice remains striking. When Rome arrives in the Middle East, it finds cities that speak Greek, keep archives, and understand treaties drafted with precise clauses. When Parthia consolidates on the Iranian plateau, it adopts coin iconography and urban governance that had matured under the Seleucids. The Hellenistic layer becomes a substrate others can build on. The lasting impact on Greek culture's spread is exact. A durable ecumene outlived the Macedonian state. Coin made contracts predictable. Cities standardized administration. Art created shared symbols. Money spoke two languages at once. Trade networks and scholarly institutions scaled across borders while kings fought and fell. The conquest political center died with the king. The cultural perimeter kept expanding by habit. Brilliance and obsession took an army from the Balkans to the Indus. Governance required successors and time. The Hellenistic world that followed was not an empire, but an operating system, languages, laws, and cities that others could use. The arc bends back to the opening claim. A single mind can conquer the world, but not always control it. 14. Conclusion. Alexander the Great forged victories through speed, deception, and unity of arms, but his state was an autocracy of one. When that will vanished, the framework fractured, and satrapies became prizes in new wars. Operational brilliance builds empires. Succession sustains them. The Hellenistic world endured because networks outlived the phalangites, like a bridge whose timbers can be replaced while traffic never stops. If you'd like exclusive early access to videos like this, and the chance to vote on future topics, please visit the channel page and consider supporting the series. Thank you to all the supporters who make this work possible. Tell us which campaign we should dissect next,